Okay, let's move on to Novalis. Here is another screen share of the book that will be available at the conference if you're there, with the poem, Hymns to the Night. And over here is what I'm going to talk about tonight. Oh, not that, but this. The Fairytale of Eros and Fable. The high mystery stands revealed, and yet it perdures as mystery evermore. The heavenly mother dwells in every human being, so that all children may be born immortal. And here are paintings by Raphael and the School of Raphael under Raphael's direct supervision from that villa in Rome that I visited a little while ago. But I used the Fairytale of Eros and Fable. I don't know if you remember it, so I'm kind of in a dilemma here. I'll talk about it. I may have to stop and summarize it a bit because you may not be up to speed on the details, but this is what I wanted to get to tonight as a part of starting to explain what I presented at Dornach. I started out by making the point that Novalis never celebrates a lone hero who does everything alone. In American literature, for example, you know this as well as I do, we love to celebrate heroes who are independent loners or even antisocial outcasts. And in European Romantic literature, we often find heroes who are lonely geniuses. We might even say that American literature has a really decidedly antisocial bias. And I could make a strong argument that this makes sense. And you know, if you're paying any attention, that antisocial bias, that I am autonomous, me, or as Frank Sinatra liked to sing, I did it my way, right? That attitude is very loud at the moment, but it's always been very loud in American literature, I would argue. Now, Novalis, on the other hand, he celebrates relationships. He celebrates heroes and heroines who build communities. And if you read it's almost embarrassing at times, but he appreciates mothers who nurse, and fathers who take care of things and bustle around, and siblings and cousins and friends with privileges, and lovers and married couples and children. And along with that, all kinds of interwoven sentient beings who sparkle brilliantly. He's all about relationship and really community. And you may not have noticed that in Novalis if you haven't read him closely. And that's part of what we're trying to do here. So the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen is typical of what I'm trying to say here. And this is what I presented. This is where I started in my talk in Dornach in German. It's a novel about poetry and the poet's journey. Heinrich finds artistic fulfillment in relationship with other people. And as I said, you can really read this everywhere in Novalis. And for those who only think of Novalis as this death-drunk, youngster who's pining away for the adolescent Sophie, that is largely a misreading of what he was about. He celebrated family. He wanted to jump into relationships. He got engaged 3 times. Pretty much right after Sophie died, he was in another relationship with Julie and getting ready to settle down and have a family. I know people get upset when I say these things, but go read that book that I wrote. It wasn't me, it was Novalis speaking for himself, that journal of 1797. Anyway, you don't have to read that. It's everywhere in the other things he wrote, like the fairy tale Atlantis that Patricia and Margaret and Mary and I did, performed. And it's especially evident in the fairy tale of Eros and Fable. And you will even find it, of course, in Hymns to the Night. So I hope you're down in San Francisco when Hymns to the Night happens and you're listening for this aspect in that poem. It's there. So tonight, I've got this will only take 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm careful with my clock, as you know. But I wanted to talk a little bit, begin talking about this chapter 9 of the first part of in Heinrich von Ofterdingen, the Fairytale of Eros and Fable. And the text will be available by the time the conference happens. That's why I showed you the book cover. That picture of Raphael, the two pictures of Raphael, that's the book cover for the translation that will be available in May, along with the translation of Hymns to the Night. So I'm hoping you remember it a little bit. You know, it starts out in the frozen northern realm of the stars, and then after that section is done, we go into an environment of home, hearth, and family. So you've got the upper world and the middle world. World of the stars with Arctur, right? Where everything is cold and frozen. That's the problem. The problem is up here in the spirit world, everything is cold and frozen and stuck and reified, and nothing's happening. And then the next part, it's not another chapter, but in my translation it is. In the next chapter, we're down in a middle realm, which is a realm of, it's like a suburban household, really. Well, suburban's the wrong word. It would be like a hof, where you got the father bustling around out in the yard, and the mother bustling around, and the nurse, and the kids are all breastfeeding here, there, everywhere, and they're sharing the breast, and everything's going on in a big family situation. Okay, so that's the setting. What you need to keep in mind when you look at this fairy tale and you're thinking about Novalis and the significance of community for him is that this is a fairy tale told for a wedding. It's the wedding of Heinrich and Matilda. Matilda is the master poet Klingsor's daughter, and they've just become engaged. So in the literary game, and this might, I don't know if this floats your boat or not, but anyway, it is important. In the literary game, this is what we would call an epithalamium, which is a poem or a literary work to celebrate a wedding. And not just celebrate a wedding, you know, good job, you're getting married. Ideally, if the poetry is really working, it should inspire the loving sexual energies that are needed for a successful wedding night. That's what it should do. And it should ideally produce a child. That's the aim. That would be the poetic aim of an epithalamium if you were going to write one. That's what you'd want to do. And that's what Novalis, at Klingsor, I should say, is doing in this fairy tale for Heinrich and Matilda, but not only for them, for the larger world in a sense. That's why he calls this a masterpiece that Heinrich really has to hear, because all the secrets of poetry in its essence are contained in this fairy tale, says Klingsor. So instead of thinking of an epithalamium as a dry as dust literary, category from dead classics, you might want to think of it as a magical spell or a tantric spell or mantra. And of course, there's an alchemical dimension to this as well, which I hope you recognize right away. It's no accident, my friends, that one of our favorite texts in anthroposophy is called The Chemical Wedding, right? Although we do often try to avoid all the excitement in it and the implicit jokes in it. Humor doesn't necessarily sit well with a lot of folks who think that spirit stuff is all very serious. Novalis wouldn't have agreed with that. Neither would Shakespeare, for that matter, of course. And speaking of Shakespeare, that same play, As You Like It, is, I don't know, maybe archetypal is the wrong word, but it's definitely in the mode of a wedding celebration piece of poetry, an epithalamium. Because if you remember it, that play concludes with multiple weddings. and with the god of marriage, Hymen, blessing all the weddings and marriage generally. So in the fairy tale of Eros and Fable, Sophie fulfills the role of Hymen in a way, and that is Sophie, not Sophia, as is often mistranslated. Sophie is not Sophia. And I know that makes what Novalis calls scribes. You know, there's a character in the fairy tale of Eros and Fable called the scribe. He's there in the household with the mom and the dad and Eros and little Fable and everybody. And the scribe sits in the corner. He's always earnestly working. He's always making a record of something. And he's very serious, very serious. He's very earnest, no joking around, writing everything down, coming up with the rules, making sure everything's lined up correctly. Well, you know, he gets completely annoyed, of course, if someone tells a joke or does something, he can't stand it. So, you know, a serious type scribe would forget that there's actually a lot of body humor living in a successful epithalamium. It goes high and it goes low, like the music of Bach, you know. Bach can be way up here in the angelic hierarchies and way down here in the barnyard where they're dancing a jig. And it's all working because this lemniscate is this artistic, poetic lemniscate of the upper and lower worlds is woven successfully. So that's what an epithalamium is fundamentally trying to do in a mythological sense, to weave this lemniscate between the upper world. I told you the fairy tale starts in the frozen world, and the lower world, so that everything starts to circulate, so that juices flow, energies flow, things start to circulate. And of course, if things are really circulating, it leads to a birth, right? The outcome of a successful wedding is a birth. And that birth of the new individual is really what we're talking about when we say the birth of a new mythology. At least for us, in our 21st century, you know, we can't really live anymore without questioning and examining and inventing our own mythologies on the basis of what's been done according to our understanding of the past. You might want to argue with that. But in a certain sense, you know, every new individual born into the world is a birth point of a new mythology and working itself out, particularly in our 21st century. So that's the background. You know, if this isn't happening, the world remains frozen and reified, as I said, like that spiritual world at the beginning of the fairy tale Eros and Fable in the realm of Arctur. Now, the next important thing to keep in mind, this is again what I was saying when I was in Dornach, the next really important thing to keep in mind is that the hero in Eros and Fable is not a hero, it's a heroine, it's a young girl. Fable. Fable is the heroine in Eros and Fable. And as we know from our work earlier on, the entire novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, is under the sign of the mother. Why do I say that? Well, if you read the novel, you know right at the beginning, it's the mother who tells the young poet, the young artist to be, come on, Heinrich, we need to make this spirit journey together, this vision quest, to visit my father, whom you've never met, the maternal grandfather, and I will come with you. The father has nothing to do. Well, the father's important, but in a different way. But the mother's really the one who's guiding the journey. Novalis does this subversion of male and female patriarchal, matriarchal roles. He's a very subversive poet in that respect. And one of the places this comes out is at the very beginning of the book. So Fable, in the fairy tale of Eros and Fable, she is the spirit of poetry, but she's not a lonely or solitary spirit. She is, in fact, a social genius. She's always in the mix. Robert, you'd like her because she's very sanguine. She's the one who weaves everything together by circulating all the time, circulating in a spirit of harmony and poetry and good humor, circulating between the upper, the lower, and the middle realms that Novalis presents in the fairy tale. And although Sophie, whom we love to talk about, has a very important role, but this is not the Sophie so adored by Novalis fans who mostly know Novalis from the sad story of the death of poor little adolescent Sophie, his fiancée. This is a different Sophie. This is really a different treatment. He's taken that relationship with the actual Sophie somewhere else, vis-a-vis the alchemical working of his poetry. And as I said, English readers, and this happens a lot, you see it quite frequently, English language readers should not make the error of calling Sophie Sophia. Now, I'll talk about Sophie, the literary character, later in the fairy tale, but right now, what we should keep in mind, and I will end on time tonight, what we should keep in mind is that Fable, a young girl, a child, actually. She's not even a mature woman. She's a child. She is the true heroine in this fairy tale. She does the Aeneas thing. She does the Aeneas thing, but she's just a kid, and she's a girl. She undertakes the heroine's journey, and she achieves the boon. She does everything. Now, Sophie is, of course, important. She presides over the entire drama, over the entire epithalamium as the eternal priestess of the heart. And she blesses, and she makes pronouncements, and she marries the spirit king Arctur at the end of the fairy tale. But Fable is really the active one. She's the young heroine in the fairy tale. You might want to say she's the Lucia Skywalker. If I were teaching this, I might say that. See if I woke my kids up. Maybe not. You may remember, think back to when we were working on this yay long ago. Remember, the fairy tale begins, Eros and Fable, it begins with this old hero, right? The old hero looks around, the city's all frozen. And at the end of that chapter, what does Arctur say? He says, "Old hero, toss your sword into the world, that the time of peace and flourishing may come about." So, we like to read that as a Michaelic gesture, which is certainly one way to do it. But what I want you to hear tonight is that this is the old hero. Fable is the young hero. She's the kid. She's the young heroine who annoys a lot of people, actually, especially the scribe, as I said. The scribe, who's very serious, very earnest about things. He can't stand Fable. And Fable will do things like scribble all over his papers and make a mess of everything he's trying to do scientifically. And what really annoys him, there's this routine going on. It's a joke running through the first part of the fairy tale. Whenever the scribe writes something, he hands it to Sophie. Here, I've written this. And she dips it into this altar vessel, which is like a grail vessel. And it's water or something in there. And she pulls it out of the vessel. And if everything that's written is still there intact, then it's okay. But every time she does it for the scribe, despite all his sincere, earnest efforts, it always comes out unreadable and blotted and running. He can't make anything stick. But when Fable scribbles something, haphazardly, Sophie dips it into the grail altar vessel, and it comes out perfectly legible and wonderful. You can just fine. And that annoys the scribe no end. So, let's see, I got 3 minutes left. What should I end up with here? Oh, I'm almost done anyway. Oh, okay. Well, I can tell you this, because we know it already, that Novalis thought very, very highly of the fairy tale as a literary genre. He thought it was really the highest form of literature. which is a little bit difficult for us to get our minds around, unless we think about what he's said about poetry. And we've talked about that many a time. And, I like to say in a kind of fable-esque way to annoy people, but I do think it's partly true, that the fairy tale is mightier than philosophy, my friends. Now, we could have a whole evening or more on that topic, because here we're going to prod the bear called Plato, aren't we? Because Plato, the serious philosopher, he wanted to banish all the poets, right? Get rid of them, because they're all liars, and they just create this semblance of truth, but it's not really true. They're really like the sophists. They're all lying and misleading and fooling you with words, and they should be gone. We need philosopher kings in our republic, not these wiggly people, these wiggly liars known as poets. Although, when you get down to it, Plato was a literary guy himself and a poet with his dialogues. But in his day, in order to get taken seriously, you needed to call yourself a philosopher, just like in our day, or recent times. The way you get taken seriously is to call yourself a scientist. So if you go down the street, if you go into an environment, you say, oh, you're in with all these heavy-duty, scientifically trained types in whatever discipline, it could be sociology, literature, physics, whatever, they all want to be called scientists. Better yet, if they can tie it all back to numbers, even better. And you walk in and you're like Novalis. You say, when numbers, math, and figures are no longer keys to every creature, I'm a poet. And let's get all this error out of the way. So you come in and say, I'm a poet. Well, people just kind of roll their eyes, right? Even, in the section, for example, it's good to be a poet. We appreciate that you're doing poetry, but we are academics. We want to do academics. Nothing wrong with academics. I love academics. Like I said, I retired from UC Davis and moved on to Berkeley. So there we are. Okay, I'm done. Now, I just conclude on this remark again tonight that, for Novalis, being a poet was an essential part of our human spiritual makeup. We needed to figure out what this poetic intelligence that he's pointing to, aka magical idealism, is all about. Figure that out. And that's where this talk in Dornach was going. I'm only at the beginning. But we'll get there maybe in later nights. Or if you want me to put it together in a more coherent Aristotelian way, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, well, I'll be doing that on April 10th for the ASA. I won't be talking in this kind of fable-esque way. I'll be sober and strict. So there we are. 8 o'clock. We're done. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in Romanticism and for your interest in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. Good night.